The dawn over ancient Jerusalem came not with noise, but with the soft hum of wind brushing over limestone walls. The city stirred beneath a veil of golden dust. Merchants unbarred their doors, priests prepared offerings, and the faithful turned their eyes toward the rising light that crowned the Temple Mount. It was a world balanced between heaven and earth, a city where every stone seemed to breathe prayer. Yet beneath its sacred streets, hidden from the worshippers who filled its courtyards, another world stirred, one known only to the chosen few who called themselves the Keepers. Their purpose was older than the crown, older even than the walls themselves. In the shadowed corridors beneath the first temple, torches flickered against carvings of stars and spirals. Men in linen robes moved silently through chambers of polished stone, tracing inscriptions with careful fingers. These were not priests of sacrifice or ceremony, but scholars of divine order, guardians of a knowledge said to flow from the mind of Solomon himself. Solomon's reign was an age of splendor and contradiction. His name was invoked in hymns as the beloved of God, yet in whispers as the master of hidden forces. He was a king who spoke with the heavens and ruled with reason, a builder whose temple mirrored the architecture of the cosmos. Every pillar, every measurement, every slab of gold inlaid within its walls was said to correspond to celestial laws, a physical reflection of divine mathematics. To the people of Israel, it was a house of God. To the keepers beneath, it was something far more, a living diagram of creation itself. By night, when the temple above was silent and the lamps burned low, Solomon would descend into the lower vaults. There, amidst the scent of myrrh and oil, he met with his inner circle, the few permitted to study the deeper mysteries. Ancient texts tell of these secret gatherings in veiled language, of voices that recited the names of angels, of stones that glowed with inscriptions invisible by day, of the seal that bore two interlocking triangles, a symbol of balance between seen and unseen worlds. The seal, it was said, was no mere ornament. Forged of gold and iron, inscribed with letters not of any earthly alphabet, it was the key to command, the harmony of opposites made manifest. With it, Solomon was able to speak to the forces of the unseen, to bind the chaotic, to summon wisdom from the void, to give structure to mystery. To wear the seal was to hold the axis of the universe upon one's hand, and to bear its terrible responsibility. The keepers understood this. They were not men of power, but of preservation. Their oaths bound them to protect the king's knowledge should the temple fall, and to pass it on to only those worthy to receive it. In their manuscripts, hidden in chambers carved deep beneath the mount, they recorded the alignment of stars, the geometry of light, the language of measure and symbol. Their ink was not merely pigment, but prayer, each curve of the script, an offering to the order that governed all creation. Above them, the world went on in splendor. The temple's courts filled with pilgrims and song. Incense rose into the air, carrying with it the prayers of a nation. Yet below, in that twilight world of stone and silence, the keepers worked without recognition, preserving the delicate balance that linked the mortal and the divine. When Solomon grew older, his wisdom deepened into silence. He no longer spoke of the seal in public, nor did he reveal the depth of his understanding to the priests who served before the altar. His closest attendants noted a change. The eyes of a man who had glimpsed something vast, something that rendered the affairs of men almost trivial. In private, he gathered his chosen disciples, those whose spirits had been tested by study and solitude. Among them were scribes, astronomers, and builders,
men who could read the language of the stars and translate it into stone. On a night when the moon hung full above Jerusalem, he led them into the lowest chamber beneath the Holy of Holies. There, amidst the scent of myrrh and oil, the king spoke of the covenant that would outlive him. He told them that empires would rise and crumble, that the temple itself would one day fall to dust. But the truth they guarded, the pattern behind all form, must endure. He placed before them a small chest, sealed with wax and inscribed with the sigil of the ring. Inside, they were told, lay the foundation of their charge, writings of balance, numbers of creation, and prayers that open the gates of understanding. Guard these not as treasure, but as flame, for knowledge is light, and light, when misused, can burn the world to ash. When Solomon's reign ended, the keepers kept their vigil. Kings changed, empires shifted, and foreign banners rose above the city's walls. Yet the Brotherhood remained, unseen, adapting, dividing, and merging through generations. Their presence became legend, then myth, a faint echo under centuries of conquest and rebuilding. When the Babylonians came and fire consumed the temple, they vanished into the smoke, carrying with them not gold nor relics, but scrolls wrapped in linen, and the last memory of the seal. Those who survived scattered eastward, into Babylon, into the deserts of Arabia and beyond. Among them were builders who would shape temples in strange lands, their designs echoing the sacred geometry of Jerusalem. Others became scholars, their writings absorbed into the libraries of foreign kings. Their code endured in fragments, in the mystical diagrams of Chaldea, in the numeric hymns of Pythagoras, in the later visions of the Kabbalists who sought to read the mind of God through number and form. Centuries would pass before the keeper's legacy stirred again, awakened by the footsteps of crusaders marching toward Jerusalem. But even then, beneath the dust and ruin of ages, the shadow of Solomon's wisdom waited, silent, patient, unbroken. The story of the Templars would begin not with the sword, but with the echo of a forgotten brotherhood that had already pledged itself to light and silence.
The centuries between the fall of Solomon's temple and the coming of the Crusaders stretched like a long breath in the memory of the earth. The ruins of Jerusalem became a palimpsest of empires, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, Roman, each inscribing its mark upon the sacred hill where the temple once stood. The voices of the keepers faded from the chronicles of men, yet their influence whispered through the quiet corridors of learning. They were no longer priests nor builders, but wanderers, vessels of memory that drifted between civilizations, carrying fragments of a vanished science. In the libraries of Alexandria, where scholars mapped the stars and debated the nature of the soul, traces of Solomonic geometry appeared in anonymous manuscripts. The diagrams spoke of the balance of the seven, the relationship between number and form, the sacred ratio through which creation harmonized itself. Greek philosophers called it the arithmos of the divine, unaware that its origins lay in the vaults beneath a ruined temple. The Pythagoreans studied sound and measure. The Hermetists pursued the union of heaven and matter, all reflections of a light once kindled in Jerusalem. Further east, in Babylon and Nineveh, scribes copied texts that blended astronomy with ritual, describing constellations as living intelligences and time as a cycle of divine breath. Among the clay tablets unearthed centuries later, scholars would find symbols curiously akin to those engraved upon the seal of Solomon: interlocking triangles, circles within squares, spirals aligned with the phases of the moon. These echoes, scattered across empires, hinted at an unbroken undercurrent of thought, a philosophy that refused to die
even as kingdoms turned to dust. It was in these hidden streams of knowledge that the spirit of the keepers endured. They no longer called themselves that name. Some became priests of foreign gods, cloaking their truths in the languages of new faiths. Others withdrew into solitude, ascetics in the deserts of Syria, mystics on the banks of the Nile, thinkers who built invisible temples of mind and number. They spoke of the word before words, the vibration that shaped matter, the geometry that bound all opposites. To them, the seal was not a relic, but a symbol of what could not be destroyed, the unity of all opposites, heaven mirrored in earth. As centuries turned, the Roman world rose in power. The city of Jerusalem, rebuilt and renamed, became but another province in an empire of roads and legions. Yet beneath the stones, the same ground slept, ancient tunnels and sealed chambers untouched by time. Roman engineers, digging for foundations, sometimes uncovered traces of worked stone inscribed with strange patterns. To most, they were meaningless. To the few who understood, they were proof that the old knowledge still lingered like a buried pulse beneath the soil. In Alexandria, now under Roman rule, the fusion of Greek philosophy and Eastern mysticism gave rise to a school of thought that would one day be known as Hermeticism. It spoke of divine architecture, of man as a reflection of the cosmos, of a secret wisdom passed from the builders of the temple to the sages of Egypt. In its writings, the name of Solomon appeared not as a king, but as a symbol, the wise artificer, the master of the seal. Through such allegories, the old flame found new language. The keeper's lineage, though unacknowledged, lived on in the minds of philosophers who believed that truth was hidden in proportion, not in power. When the world shifted again and Christianity spread through the Roman world, the memory of Solomon's temple took on a sacred weight. The early church saw in it a prophecy, a structure that prefigured the divine order of heaven. Yet in the monastic schools that rose from the desert fathers of Egypt and Palestine, there were whispers of older things. Among the Coptic monks who prayed in solitude among ruins, fragments of texts survived, writings that spoke of Solomon's ring, of spirits bound by command, of the geometry of divine speech. The Church forbade such studies, calling them dangerous curiosities. But the monks, keepers of forgotten languages, preserved them nonetheless, copying their diagrams into the margins of psalters and gospel books. By the 7th century, the rise of Islam transformed Jerusalem once more. Upon the very ground where Solomon's temple had stood, the Dome of the Rock was built, a monument of perfect symmetry and quiet radiance. Its builders, master craftsmen from across the caliphate, designed it according to proportions that echoed the same ancient harmonies. The octagonal base, the golden dome, the circle and square interwoven, all spoke of a geometry that transcended creed. For those who knew how to read its design, it was as though the shadow of the seal had been cast anew upon the earth. Some scholars within the Abbasid court of Baghdad, studying mathematics and the works of the ancients, rediscovered elements of this hidden heritage. They translated Greek and Hebrew texts into Arabic, preserving not only the knowledge of numbers and stars, but the philosophy of balance that underlie them. Among these scholars were the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, a secretive society of philosophers who wrote of the harmony of the universe and the unity of all faiths. Their writings, steeped in allegory, spoke of a lost order of wisdom that once kept the covenant between heaven and earth. Though they never named Solomon, their symbols revealed the lineage of his thought. Meanwhile, in the deserts of the Holy Land, beneath the quiet sands that drifted over the Temple Mount, time buried the last remnants of the original keepers. The entrances to their chambers collapsed, their scrolls sealed in darkness. The voices that had once whispered the language of creation fell silent. But silence, too, has memory. The stones remembered the hands that shaped them. The air remembered the prayers once spoken beneath it. And when the Crusaders would one day come, driven by faith and ambition, it would be to this silence that they unknowingly returned. For the line of the keepers was not broken, only hidden. Their wisdom had dissolved into the bloodstream of the world, waiting for a time when it would be sought again. And that time was nearing.
The year was 1099. Jerusalem, the city of prophets and kings, lay still beneath a blood-red dawn. Smoke rose from its shattered gates, mingling with the scent of iron and dust. The First Crusade had reached its terrible climax. After weeks of siege, Christian knights had breached the city's walls, their banners glinting in the rising sun. What had once been the crossroads of ancient faiths now echoed with the cries of conquest and the silence of the fallen. For the Crusaders, it was victory, divine, ordained, unthinkable. For the land itself, it was yet another turning of the endless wheel of conquest. Beneath the rubble, beneath the stones sanctified by millennia of prayer, the earth kept its secret. The tomb of Solomon's wisdom, long forgotten but not lost. In the days following the capture of the city, the new rulers of Jerusalem began their work. Churches were consecrated, relics unearthed, and foreign banners hoisted upon towers once raised by caliphs. Among the Crusaders, there were those whose zeal went beyond battle. Men who had come not only to fight for the cross, but to seek the mysteries whispered about in the courts of Europe. They had heard tales of the Holy City not merely as the site of Christ's Passion, but as the resting place of an older covenant, one sealed in the age of Solomon. Among these men were knights who, one day, would be known to history as the founders of the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Templars. But in 1099, they were simply wanderers amid the ruins. The order had not yet been born. Its name, its vows, and its purpose were still hidden in the folds of destiny. But fate was already drawing them toward the mountain that crowned the city, the Temple Mount, where, beneath centuries of rebuilding and decay, the last traces of Solomon's secret brotherhood lay entombed. The conquerors turned the ancient Al-Aqsa Mosque into royal quarters, calling it the Templum Salomonis, the Temple of Solomon. To them, this was a symbol of triumph, a Christian stronghold built upon the bones of the Hebrew temple and the legacy of Islam. But to a few, it was more than a symbol. It was an invitation, a whisper across time. The ground they now walked upon had been sanctified by mystery older than Scripture, older than creed. The deeper they dug for foundations, the more they unearthed fragments that defied understanding. Stones carved with indecipherable sigils, shards of mosaic arranged in geometric precision, tunnels that led into darkness and ended in silence. The chroniclers of the age did not record these discoveries, yet among the Crusaders' ranks were men trained not only in arms, but in study. They recognized the markings, though they could not name their source. Some believed them to be remnants of the temple priests, others thought them pagan. But there were whispers, faint and persistent, that they were the works of a forgotten order, one that had vanished when Babylon burned the city long ago. In the evenings, when the heat of the day subsided and the wind moved softly through the empty courts of the mount, a few of the knights gathered there in secret. They came not for war,
but for contemplation. They spoke of the strange peace that seemed to linger in the ruins, a stillness that calmed the heart, yet stirred the mind. They wondered whether they had come not only to conquer a city, but to awaken something sleeping beneath it. One of these men, according to later tradition, was Hugues de Payens, a quiet nobleman of Champagne, known more for discipline than ambition. He spent long hours within the temple precincts, walking its corridors as though listening for a voice that others could not hear. His companions noted his fascination with the site. While others celebrated their spoils, he remained withdrawn, studying the architecture, the alignment of the walls, the proportions of the chambers. It was said he once remarked that the temple seemed built not by human measure, but by divine pattern, as though its stones still obeyed the geometry of heaven. By the early 12th century, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem had been established. Pilgrims from Europe began to flow into the Holy Land in numbers unseen since antiquity. The journey was perilous. The roads teemed with bandits, the deserts with unseen dangers. It was then that a small group of knights formed a vow to protect the pilgrims traveling to the Holy City. They swore poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating themselves to the service of Christ and the temple. King Baldwin II, seeing their devotion, granted them quarters within the Templum Solomonis itself. Thus began the Order of the Temple, the Templars. But their true mission, whispered only among themselves, was not protection alone. Beneath the mount, in the labyrinth of ancient tunnels that had once belonged to Solomon's priests, they began to excavate. What they sought, none outside their circle would ever know. 9 years they labored in secret. By day they trained, patrolled, and prayed. By night they descended into the earth. Some chronicles mention this only in passing, describing them as searching for relics. Yet in the legends that survived, in the writings of later mystics, and in the tales of troubadours, those 9 years became the seed of their transformation. When they emerged, they were no longer mere knights of flesh and blood, but men touched by knowledge, bearers of something unseen. No record remains of what they found beneath the temple. Some said it was the Ark of the Covenant, hidden since the Babylonian conquest. Others spoke of golden tablets engraved with the names of angels, or of scrolls written in the language of creation itself. A few whispered that they found a fragment of the seal, the very ring once worn by Solomon, whose power was not of this world. What is known is this. After those 9 years, the order changed. Their eyes, once filled with the fire of Crusade, now carried the calm of vision. Their organization grew with astonishing speed. The Pope himself granted them privileges that defied precedent, exemption from taxes answerable only to the Holy See. Kings entrusted them with their wealth, their lands, their secrets. Within a generation, they became the most disciplined and formidable brotherhood of their age. And yet there was something beyond the visible, a quiet knowledge in their rituals, an echo of something far older than the church they served. In the design of their chapels, in the patterns of their seals, in the geometry of their fortresses, one could trace the same proportions that had once guided the builders of Solomon's temple. Circles within squares, triangles folded into pentagrams, patterns of balance and reflection, body mirroring spirit. They had rediscovered, it seemed, what the keepers had once guarded, the secret harmony between heaven and earth. Thus the lineage was reborn, the covenant renewed in silence. The world would come to know them as the Knights Templar. But beneath the armor and the vows, they carried a name older than any banner: the Order of Solomon.
The Order of the Temple grew quietly at first. A handful of knights, austere and disciplined, living within the shadowed chambers of the Temple Mount. But the currents of time move swiftly when destiny stirs. What began as a modest brotherhood of 9 soon drew the attention of kings, bishops, and pilgrims alike. Their humility, their courage, and their unbroken silence marked them as men apart. They asked for nothing, accepted no reward, and yet carried themselves with the calm certainty of those who served a purpose larger than any crown. By 1119, their name had reached the court of King Baldwin II of Jerusalem. He saw in them a rare devotion, knights who lived not for conquest, but for vow. He offered them formal recognition and quarters within the royal palace that stood upon the ancient site of Solomon's temple. From that moment, they were known as the Pauperes Commilitones Christi Templice Solomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. The name was both title and prophecy. Few understood that it was more than honorific. It was a declaration of continuity, a reawakening of the temple's original keepers. The Templars' rule was simple, severe, and precise. Their days began and ended with prayer. Their armor was plain, their cloaks unadorned. They slept in communal holes upon straw, shared their meals in silence, and obeyed without hesitation. They were warriors, yet also monks, men who blended the sword and the psalter, who believed that the discipline of the body mirrored the purity of the soul. To outsiders, they appeared as models of Christian humility, but among themselves deeper teachings took root, lessons not of theology, but of order. Within the ancient vaults beneath their quarters, they studied the geometry of the temple's foundations. They mapped the tunnels that wound beneath the mount, tracing their alignment with the stars above. Some spoke of inscriptions carved into the bedrock, circles, hexagrams, and letters of unknown form, relics of the keepers who had come before. These symbols, once deciphered, revealed not words, but ratios, the hidden music of creation. To the initiated, this was the true inheritance of Solomon, not wealth nor relic, but understanding, the key to harmony between heaven and man. It was during these years that Hugues de Payens began his journeys westward. His mission, publicly, was to seek the Church's blessing and support for his fledgling order. But in his travels across France and England, he also gathered something less tangible: the scattered embers of ancient learning. In the abbeys of Burgundy and the libraries of Chartres, he met with scholars who preserved fragments of Pythagorean thought, Hermetic philosophy, and Kabbalistic tradition. These men, bound by curiosity and faith, recognized in the Templars a kindred spirit. They saw that the Knights' discipline concealed a deeper search, a quest for divine order through knowledge and design. When Hugues stood before Pope Honorius II and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, he spoke of purity, humility, and the protection of pilgrims. Bernard, a mystic and theologian of profound vision, saw in the order something beyond chivalry, an echo of the ancient wisdom that united action and contemplation. Under his influence, the Templars' spiritual rule was codified: poverty, chastity, obedience, and defense of the faith. But within its measured lines, subtle language endured, phrases that hinted at light, silence, and inner revelation. Bernard's own treatise, De Laude Noave Militae, in praise of the new knighthood, described them as warriors who fought both visible and invisible battles,
whose true strength lay not in arms, but in the order of their souls. In this harmony of purpose, the Templars flourished. Their fame spread through Europe like fire through dry grass. Nobles offered their lands and fortunes. Young men of lineage sought to join their ranks. Within a generation, they possessed estates across Christendom, farms, castles, and commanderies that sustained their missions in the East. Yet for all their growing influence, they remained bound by the same austerity. Their churches, though beautifully constructed, followed strict geometric patterns, circles, octagons, and perfect squares, modeled upon the Temple of Solomon itself. In these proportions, they believed the divine was made visible. Their architects were not ordinary builders. They worked by number and symbol, guided by measurements derived from Scripture and the stars. The octagonal churches of Europe, in London, Tomar, Laon, and beyond, all reflected the same invisible law, the union of earth and heaven through sacred geometry. Their symmetry was prayer cast in stone. Even the placement of their windows followed the path of the sun, illuminating the altar at precise moments of the year, a silent reminder of celestial rhythm. It was said that before each construction, the Templars performed a rite of dedication. They traced upon the ground the seal of Solomon, marking the space where the new structure would rise. The intersection of its triangles symbolized balance, the descent of spirit into matter, and the ascent of matter toward spirit. In this, their work echoed the hidden legacy of the keepers, the architects of divine proportion, whose memory lingered beneath the mount. While their influence expanded, so did their mystery. Unlike other orders, the Templars admitted few outsiders to their rituals. Their initiation was conducted in secret, its words known only to the brethren. Chroniclers described oaths sworn in darkness, the kiss of brotherhood, the renunciation of personal will. But later centuries would claim there were other invocations, of light, of understanding, of names that were not Latin nor Greek, but older still. Whether these were inventions or remnants of ancient practice, no man could say. Yet the power of their silence spoke louder than any testimony. As the 12th century matured, the Templars became not only warriors and builders, but bankers, engineers, and diplomats. Their network stretched from Scotland to Jerusalem, from the ports of the Mediterranean to the markets of Constantinople. They were trusted by kings and feared by many, yet their true center remained unchanged, the Temple Mount, their first and most sacred home. Pilgrims reported that even amid war, the knights still gathered there at night, descending into the earth with torches. What they sought or guarded remained unknown. Perhaps it was faith. Perhaps it was memory. Or perhaps it was the quiet pulse of a knowledge that had never died. In those subterranean halls where the keepers once whispered prayers to the order of the cosmos, the Templars now stood, heirs to a covenant they barely understood. And though the centuries separated them from Solomon's court, the geometry of their world still echoed his voice. Above the mount, the wind sang through the ruins. Below, in the stillness of stone, the ancient order endured, patient, unseen, eternal.
The early decades of the 12th century saw the Knights Templar ascend from obscurity into a force that shaped the fabric of medieval Christendom. From the deserts of Jerusalem to the cathedrals of France, their white mantles embroidered with red crosses became symbols of both purity and enigma. Yet as their fame grew, so too did the quiet depth of their hidden pursuits. Beneath the surface of faith and war, the order continued to seek that which had once guided Solomon's builders, the geometry of divine balance.
At the heart of this transformation stood the relationship between the Templars and the Cistercian monks, especially the luminous figure of Bernard of Clairvaux. A mystic steeped in the language of contemplation, Bernard saw in the Templars a living embodiment of the dual nature of the soul, the warrior and the monk, the active and the contemplative united in harmony. To him, they were not simply defenders of the Holy Land, but participants in a spiritual architecture, a living temple rising from discipline and silence. Under his influence, the Templars' rule took on a rhythm as measured as the geometry they revered. Their days were divided by prayer and service, their nights by vigilance and meditation. Even in battle, they fought not for vengeance or conquest, but for the preservation of order. Chroniclers recorded their composure amid chaos, ranks moving like a single body, guided by unseen precision. This discipline, they said, was their miracle, an earthly reflection of celestial harmony. The world saw knights, the order saw builders of balance. In their commanderies across Europe, that vision took form in stone. Templar architects did not design with ornament, but with intention. Every curve, every arch, every shaft of light that entered their round churches carried meaning. These sanctuaries, often octagonal or circular, were modeled upon the dome of the rock, the sacred geometry that had first awakened their order on the Temple Mount. But their proportions also concealed older principles, the ratios of the Great Pyramid, the measures described in the writings of Vitruvius, and the cosmic order encoded in Scripture. Visitors to these chapels would later speak of their stillness, a silence that seemed to resonate, as though the air itself remembered prayer. Some claimed to feel a subtle vibration within the walls, an almost imperceptible harmony. It was said that the Templars measured not only with rope and compass, but with sound, chanting notes that determined the resonance of stone. Whether this was legend or lost technique, none could say, but to those who entered such spaces, the sensation was unmistakable, the sense of standing within a living equation where spirit and matter breathed as one. The Templars' understanding of number and form extended beyond architecture. Their organization mirrored the patterns they studied, a hierarchy that reflected cosmic symmetry. At its heart stood the Grand Master, surrounded by officers whose roles symbolized the elements: command, wisdom, protection, and service. Beneath them, the ranks of knights, sergeants, and servants formed concentric circles of purpose, each dependent on the others. To the Templars, this was not bureaucracy, but theology, the order of heaven made manifest on earth. As their influence expanded, their network of commanderies became more than military outposts. They were centers of study and preservation, repositories of knowledge gathered from every corner of the known world. Within their walls, scrolls from the East mingled with texts from ancient Greece, Coptic codices, and Hebrew manuscripts. Translators worked by candlelight, rendering words of forgotten sages into Latin. Among these were writings on mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, subjects often viewed with suspicion by the Church, but which the Templars considered pathways to understanding creation itself. Their contact with Islamic scholars during truces and negotiations brought them even closer to the roots of their lineage. The Arabs had preserved and expanded upon the sciences of antiquity, geometry, optics, and alchemy. In Damascus and Baghdad, libraries flourished with texts that echoed the same principles once guarded beneath the Temple Mount. Some Templar envoys, under the guise of diplomacy, sought these manuscripts. They exchanged gifts, not of gold, but of ink and parchment. In their eyes, knowledge was a form of worship, an act of reverence for the divine intellect that structured the world. By mid-century, their wealth and reach astonished even kings. They built fortresses along the pilgrim routes, ports on the coasts, and strongholds in the desert whose designs defied siege and time. Yet for all their outward might, they remained bound by secrecy. Initiates swore oaths not only of loyalty, but of silence. Silence to guard the mysteries that could not be spoken out loud. Rumors spread among the common folk that the Templars communed with angels, that they possessed relics beyond imagining, that their prayers turned night into day. The Church dismissed such tales, but even among the clergy, curiosity grew. What did the Templars truly worship in the depths of their chapels? What secret knowledge guided their hand? Those who entered their inner circle spoke of a ritual unlike any other in Christendom. Before dawn, the brethren gathered in darkness. A single lamp burned at the center, its flame reflected in the polished metal of a sword laid upon the altar. The Grand Master would speak words in Latin and another tongue, softer, older. Then the brothers would kneel, their foreheads touching the cold stone floor, while the light of the lamp flickered against the walls in the form of the seal. To the uninitiated, it was but ceremony. To the brethren, it was remembrance, the renewal of vow made long before their birth. It was during this period that another name began to appear in secret documents, Ordo Solomon, the Order of Solomon. Whether it referred to an inner branch of the Templars or to the ancient lineage they believed themselves to inherit, none can be certain. But its symbolism endured. To the Templars, Solomon was not merely a biblical king. He was the archetype of wisdom, the master of sacred measure, the bridge between divine and mortal knowledge. To bear his name was to claim descent from the first builders of light. The Templars' success, however, did not come without shadow. Wealth invited envy. Power invited suspicion. Their secrecy became fuel for rumor, their silence a mirror upon which others projected fear. Yet through it all, they remained unwavering, patient, methodical, their gaze fixed on the geometry of eternity. And beneath their fortresses, in catacombs and libraries sealed from the eyes of the world, the order continued its true labor, the study of correspondence between heaven and earth, between symbol and truth, the same labor that had begun 1,000 years before, when Solomon first raised his temple to the stars. The brotherhood that had once hidden beneath the Temple Mount was alive again, not as priests, but as warriors, not as servants of one creed, but as seekers of the same light. And as the 12th century waned, their reach extended beyond battlefields and beyond faith, into the very structure of Western world. The silence of Solomon had become the foundation of Christendom's most enigmatic order.
The winter of 1147 fell harsh upon the Levant. Winds swept down from the highlands of Samaria, carrying with them the scent of rain and iron, a harbinger of both renewal and ruin. Along the coast of Acre, a fleet of Templar ships rocked gently against their moorings. Their sails, marked with the Crimson Cross, fluttered like torn pages of a sacred text. Within their hulls lay not only weapons and supplies, but something far more guarded, sealed chests of cedar and iron, each marked with the sigil of the Temple Mount. By dawn, the knights began their preparations for departure. Their destination was not Jerusalem nor Antioch, but the shores of Europe, a return long delayed. Among those overseeing the operation was Geoffrey de Saint-Omer, one of the few remaining founding brothers. His beard had whitened with years of crusade, yet his gaze retained the sharpness of one accustomed to reading more than the visible. He watched as the younger knights hoisted the last of the crates aboard, their breath misting in the chill air. Beside him stood a Cistercian abbot, cloaked in rough wool, his hands folded in silence. Between them passed no words, only a mutual understanding. These chests contained relics recovered from beneath the temple, objects whose meaning was known to few and whose power was whispered about by many. Some claimed they held fragments of the Ark,
Others believed them to be tablets inscribed with celestial coordinates, relics of the geometry that had once defined Solomon's temple. Jeffery knew better. They were not treasures of gold, but instruments of measure, compasses, astrolabes, and engraved discs of bronze that spoke the language of the stars. As the tide receded, the fleet slipped westward into the gray horizon, carrying with it not only relics, but a doctrine, the Solomonic Code, destined to take root in foreign soil. Months later, in the rolling hills of Burgundy, the first of these chests was received at a small Cistercian abbey under the protection of Bernard of Clairvaux. It was here, away from the scrutiny of the Holy See, that the Templars began to codify their discoveries. In a vaulted chamber lit by tallow lamps, parchment was spread across wooden tables. Lines and circles filled the pages, diagrams of proportions, sketches of the Dome of the Rock, and formulas written in a strange blend of Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic. Brother Hughes de Champagne, once a count and now a Templar initiate, leaned over one such parchment with furrowed brow. He murmured, "The ratio recurs, 3 to 5, 5 to 8, as if the stones themselves obey a rhythm of life." Bernard, seated across from him, nodded. The ancients called it harmonia mundi, the music of creation. Perhaps Solomon heard it as we hear prayer. Their collaboration was quiet, deliberate, and veiled. To the Church, this work was architecture. To the Templars, it was resurrection, the rebuilding of the inner temple, not of stone, but of understanding. By 1150, a new generation of Templar fortresses began to rise across Europe and the Holy Land. They shared a pattern unseen in the works of other orders, geometric symmetry tied to celestial alignments. Each fortress, from Tomar in Portugal to Chastel Blanc in Syria, was constructed according to a master grid derived from the same set of proportions found in the ancient temple's foundation. Their positioning, when traced upon a map, formed an intricate network of alignments that some would later call the Path of Solomon, a terrestrial reflection of constellations above. Travelers who passed through these fortresses spoke of their stillness. Even in times of siege, the Templars seemed unmoved by chaos. To them, war was ritual, each maneuver an extension of their code. Before battle, they gathered in silence, their swords crossed over the seal of Solomon carved into the floor, whispering words no chronicler dared transcribe. Those who survived their ranks often recalled a strange illumination in the eyes of the knights. Not madness, but clarity. They fought not for victory, but for equilibrium. When they spoke of God, it was not of vengeance or wrath, but of balance. To them, evil was not a force to destroy, but a shadow to be understood, the necessary counterpart of light. Far to the west, in the mountains of Languedoc, rumors began to spread among the Cathars, a sect condemned as heretical by Rome, that the Templars were their protectors. They spoke of a shared knowledge, a secret lineage that predated the church itself. In hidden gatherings, troubadours sang of the Chevaliers du Soleil, the Knights of the Sun, who guarded the wisdom of Solomon and the divine feminine they called Sophia. Some claimed that the Templars had found in Jerusalem a scroll describing not only the seal, but the union of male and female principles within creation, the true secret of the temple. In this merging of opposites lay the essence of their hidden theology. The Templars' reverence for balance, light and shadow, heaven and earth, spirit and matter, was more than philosophy. It was practice. Their rituals invoked not saints or martyrs, but the cosmic principles of creation itself. And within their sanctuaries, beneath the cross, there often stood a second symbol, a rose, carved in subtle relief. The rose and the cross, a union of geometry and life, of structure and soul. By the close of the 12th century, the Order of Solomon, veiled beneath the name of the Templars, had become the silent spine of Christendom. They financed kings, advised scholars, and mapped the heavens. Yet even as their influence reached across continents, a deeper transformation was underway. Their mission, once centered on the Holy Land, had turned inward. The temple they sought to rebuild was no longer of limestone and cedar, but of human understanding. And so, in candlelit halls from Jerusalem to Paris, initiates were taught a single phrase before their vows were sealed. As above, so below. As within, so without. The temple is not found, it is awakened.
The dawn of the 13th century rose over Europe like a tide of stone and song. Cathedrals blossomed where fields once lay bare, vast forests of pillars and light rising toward the heavens with a purpose both sacred and mysterious. Chartres, Reims, Amiens, Notre Dame, each bore the same geometric signature, the same silent order written into their foundations, and behind their construction, in ledgers and whispers, the Templars' seal appeared again and again. To the faithful, these cathedrals were monuments to divine glory, but to those who understood the Solomonic code, they were far more than houses of worship. They were instruments, vast harmonic engines built to capture and reflect celestial harmony. The masons who labored upon them worked from scrolls unlike any the church had sanctioned, patterns derived from the same measurements once buried beneath the Temple Mount. Beneath the scaffolds and flying buttresses, master builders spoke of le secret du temple, the hidden proportion of God. It was said that a man who stood in the nave of Chartres at noon and followed the beam of sunlight striking the labyrinth could measure not only the path of the earth, but the rhythm of his own soul. The Templars, ever silent, funded these works without explanation. The abbots asked no questions, and the bishops, dazzled by the wealth that flowed from the temple's coffers, blessed what they did not understand. The order's presence in Europe had changed. Once the sword arm of Christendom, they had become its unseen heart, a network of fortresses, farms, ports, and archives spanning from Portugal to the Holy Land. Their ships carried not only grain and silver, but coded manuscripts, instruments of measure, and the occasional relic wrapped in silence. Within their commanderies, particularly in Aragon and Poitou, a new generation of knights studied more than warfare. Under the guidance of former scholars and monks, they learned geometry, astronomy, and the principles of proportion. Some said that these teachings were meant to glorify God through architecture. Others suspected that they pointed towards something deeper, the understanding of divine manifestation itself. At night, when the torches burned low, circles were drawn in chalk upon the stone floors. The knights traced them with their blades, murmuring prayers in tones closer to meditation than chant. They spoke of lux, the inner light, and the ladder of ascent, an idea as old as Solomon and as dangerous as knowledge could be in the hands of men of faith. Yet not all within Christendom looked upon their growing influence with peace. In the papal courts of Rome, murmurs spread like smoke. How could these warriors, sworn to poverty, command the wealth of nations? How could they build cathedrals grander than kings and move armies without crown or papal decree? It was Pope Innocent III who first summoned their Grand Master to explain their doctrine. The meeting was courteous, veiled in diplomacy, but behind the courtesy lay unease. The Templars' autonomy had become absolute. They owed allegiance only to the Pope, but they answered questions only with silence. When pressed on their rituals, they offered only Scripture and the seal of Christ. When asked about their treasures, they spoke of service and sacrifice.
No heresy could yet be proven, but something in their composure, that calm equilibrium of light and shadow, disturbed the Holy See. For centuries the Church had been the guardian of faith. Now it found itself standing beside a mirror that reflected another kind of holiness, one it could not command. In the south of France, the air was different. The Languedoc sun shone upon a culture of refinement and doubt. Troubadours sang of forbidden love, poets of the divine feminine, and Cathar preachers of duality. Two gods, light and dark, locked in eternal balance. The Church called it heresy. The Templars called it memory. For in these teachings, echoes of the Solomonic doctrine returned. The Cathars' belief in a divided creation, matter as the veil of spirit, was not far from the ancient texts preserved by the keepers of the seal. The Templars offered them shelter, discreetly, in fortresses along the Pyrenees. In exchange, the Cathar elders shared with them fragments of forgotten scriptures, gospels that spoke of wisdom as a living presence, not a possession. At Montessor, it is said, a small circle of Templars and perfects met under the full moon. There they performed a ritual of light, an invocation that blended Hebrew psalms with Latin prayer. Witnesses would later describe a radiant flame that burned without smoke upon the altar stone, but no one ever spoke of what followed. When decades later, the fortress fell and the Cathars were burned in their thousands, the Templars vanished quietly from the region, taking with them only a few manuscripts and an unmarked reliquary carved with the seal of Solomon. By 1250, the Templar archives had grown vast, stored in commanderies from Cyprus to Paris, in chests bound with iron. Few knew what they contained, but among them were diagrams of the Temple Mount, treatises on alchemy written in the margins of psalms, and fragments of Arabic texts on the nature of light. Scholars who glimpsed them spoke of a synthesis, Greek, Hebrew, and Islamic knowledge woven into a single thread. The Church tolerated their secrecy so long as their swords defended the Holy Land. But even that began to change. The Crusader states were crumbling. Jerusalem had fallen again. The Templars' mission outwardly was failing, but within the order, another conviction took hold, that their true crusade was no longer of conquest, but of understanding, the recovery of the divine pattern lost to mankind. And so their cathedrals stood as silent witnesses to this transformation. The stones of Amiens and Chartres, the arches of Tomar and Laon, all seemed to hum with an unseen resonance, as if very geometry of the world had been summoned into form. To stand within their walls was to feel the same stillness that once dwelt beneath the Temple Mount, a peace born not of dogma, but of proportion. In those quiet spaces, the Templars' creed endured, unspoken but alive. The temple is within. The stone and the soul are one measure. Balance is the law of light.
In the waning years of the 13th century, Europe stood at a threshold between devotion and doubt. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and iron, of prayer and empire. The Crusades had burned themselves into exhaustion, and the Holy Land, once the stage of Christendom's glory, now rested under the crescent of Islam once more. Yet the Templars, though stripped of their sacred battleground, remained intact, wealthy, secretive, and unsettlingly silent. Their fortresses dotted the map like constellations of stone, their coffers overflowed with gold, and their ships commanded the Mediterranean as if by unseen charter. Kings borrowed from them, popes depended upon them, and the people, who once hailed them as holy warriors, now whispered uneasily about the power they had acquired. In this climate of uncertainty,
suspicion took root not in the hearts of peasants or priests, but in the marble halls of Rome and the royal court of France. King Philip IV, called Le Bel, the Fair, ruled a kingdom gilded on the surface and hollow beneath. His wars had drained the treasury, his debts hung like chains about his crown, and his pride refused subservience to any mortal man, least of all the Pope. Yet there remained one power he could not compel by decree: the Temple. When Philip's envoys sought to collect debts, the Templars presented ledgers sealed and exact, a labyrinth of loans, oaths, and property too vast for even a king to untangle. Their network stretched beyond his reach, their ships carried wealth he could not tax, and their loyalty, pledged only to God and the papacy, rendered them untouchable. To Philip, they were not holy men, but rivals. And rivals, in his court, were merely enemies in waiting. Meanwhile, within the walls of the temple in Paris, a fortress of grey stone rising above the Seine, the inner circle of the order met in silence. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, stood before a gathering of senior knights and chaplains. Time had lined his face, yet his eyes bore the same calm fire that marked the Brotherhood's earliest founders. On the table before them lay three objects: a worn codex written in cipher, a fragment of a bronze disc etched with concentric circles, and a small reliquary carved with the seal of Solomon. The codex was said to be one of the last texts preserved from beneath the Temple Mount, the Liber Lux, or Book of Light. It spoke of the union between divine will and human understanding, the sacred geometry by which creation mirrored its creator. Molay lifted his gaze from the relics. He said, "Brothers, the temple is no longer in Jerusalem, nor in stone. It is within us, in the balance we guard. But balance draws the envy of those who rule through fear." A murmur passed through the hall. Some feared the king's growing hostility. Others feared something subtler, that the wisdom they carried, passed down from Solomon's keepers, would be lost in the fires of politics. One of the elder knights, Brother Geoffroy de Gonville, spoke quietly. "If the crown moves against us, we will fall not for our deeds, but for what we represent, knowledge unchained from the throne." Molay nodded. "Then we must hide the light before the shadow arrives." That night, under the cover of the winter mist, scribes labored in the lower halls, copying fragments of the Liber Lux into smaller scrolls. Couriers were sent to Portugal, Scotland, and Aragon, lands where the king's reach faltered. The relics, too, were dispersed. Some were said to be carried by sea toward Tomar, others sealed within abbey walls known only to a handful of initiates. It was the beginning of an exodus, not of men, but of knowledge. But secrets are like embers. They burn brightest when the world grows dark. In 1305, Pope Clement V ascended the papal throne, a man of delicate balance between faith and fear. Bound by politics to King Philip, he was pressured to investigate the order. Reports arrived from across Christendom, whispers of blasphemy, of rituals performed in darkness, of idols and secret oaths. None were proven, all were repeated. The accusations grew with each retelling, that the Templars denied Christ, spat upon the cross, worshipped a severed head named Baphomet. The name, so strange to Latin tongues, may have been nothing more than a distortion of Abu Fihamat, the father of understanding, the old Solomonic title for divine wisdom, but in Rome, translation had no mercy. By 1307, the king's patience broke. On Friday, the 13th of October, royal officers spread across France with sealed orders. At dawn, the Templars were seized. Every knight, every squire, every servant of the temple. Their fortresses were stormed, their treasuries confiscated, their archives sealed under the royal crest. Jacques de Molay himself was taken at the temple in Paris. He offered no resistance. His hands, unarmed for the first time in decades, were bound in chains. The streets whispered as he passed, not curses, but prayers. The trials that followed were a theater of fear. Under torture, confessions were extracted, retracted, and rewritten. Some knights, broken by pain, confessed to heresies they had never heard of. Others died in silence, their lips pressed in prayer. The church, torn between doubt and dread, watched as the order's honor crumbled beneath the weight of accusation. Yet amid the chaos, certain records vanished. In the archives of Paris, ledgers and maps disappeared overnight. Ships flying the Templar banner left La Rochelle and were never seen again. Some said they fled to Scotland, others to Portugal, where King Denis, sympathetic to their cause, later founded the Order of Christ, a new name for an old brotherhood. Still, in Rome, Clement hesitated. To condemn the Templars was to sever a branch of the Church's own arm. To absolve them was to provoke the wrath of the crown. For 2 years the trials dragged on, until at last the verdict was sealed in silence. The order was dissolved, its lands seized, its brothers dispersed. In March of 1314, Jacques de Molay was led to a small island upon the Seine. The sun was setting, and the sky burned with the color of iron. Before a crowd of onlookers, he was bound to a wooden stake. When asked for his confession, he spoke only once. Truth is not a flame to be quenched. It is light, and light returns. As the fire rose around him, witnesses said his eyes reflected not fear, but calm, the same stillness once seen in the halls beneath the Temple Mount. Some claimed that as the flames consumed him, the smoke curled into the shape of a seal, a 6-pointed star of light. Others saw only ash carried by the wind. But among the crowd were those who knew better. For the fire that burned in Paris was not an end, but a veil, and beyond it the light of Solomon's covenant still endured, waiting for those who could read its geometry in the silence of the centuries to come.
When the ashes of Jacques de Molay scattered into the wind above the scene, the Templar Order was declared dead. Yet across the breadth of Europe and beyond the line of the Western Sea, something still stirred in secret. The flames that consumed the Grand Master had not extinguished the light. They had scattered it, like embers carried upon a hidden wind. In the years that followed 1314, France turned its gaze elsewhere, believing the temple dismantled and its wealth absorbed. But in the quiet hours before dawn, along lonely coastal roads and in monastic cloisters untouched by royal decree, remnants of the Brotherhood gathered. They no longer wore the red cross or carried the white mantle. They rode as merchants, pilgrims, and masons, men whose vows had been burned from parchment but not from memory. Their lodestar was not Rome nor Jerusalem, but the West, toward lands where the king's reach faltered and the Inquisition's voice grew faint. In Portugal, King Denis received them with the caution of a man who knew both the Church's wrath and the worth of loyal men. Officially, the Templars were dissolved, yet in 1319 a decree was issued that created a new order, Ordem de Christo, the Order of Christ, absorbing the Templar lands, fortresses, and traditions under a different name. The Pope, perhaps weary of blood, sanctioned it. The Red Cross returned, subtly altered, its lines broadened, its meaning preserved. Within the citadel of Tamar, life resumed. The fortress, perched above the Nabo River,
had been a Templar stronghold for nearly 2 centuries. Now it became a sanctuary for the Solomonic legacy, a continuation cloaked in legality. Behind its stone walls, the rites of the temple endured, though stripped of war's trappings. The knights studied navigation, astronomy, and the geometry of the heavens. Their prayer halls were carved with spiraling motifs of the rose and the cross, their ceilings painted with constellations instead of saints. They saw in the sea not a barrier, but a mirror, a vast, liquid reflection of the sky. Among their ranks rose men who would later guide Portugal's age of exploration. Prince Henry, known to history as the Navigator, would inherit not only wealth, but a map of the world, encoded with lines of latitude and symbols drawn from the old Solomonic diagrams. The same geometry once used to build temples now shaped the routes of ships. The sacred proportions became the compass by which new worlds were sought. The temple, reborn upon the ocean. Far to the north, another branch survived in shadow. In Scotland, the Templar fleet that vanished from La Rochelle found refuge among the rugged shores and misted isles. The land was wild, half Christian, half pagan, a kingdom fractured by wars with England, but bound by ancient loyalties. Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by Rome, and thus free from papal obedience, welcomed them. On the eve of Bannockburn in 1314, legend claims that a band of armored riders, bearing no banner, appeared upon the field and turned the tide of battle. Chroniclers would later dismiss it as myth, yet in the ruins of certain abbeys, carvings of the Templar cross can still be found, etched long after their supposed destruction. Those who remained in Scotland lay low, merging with local mason guilds, builders, and craftsmen. In their gatherings, beneath chapels carved into the rock, they continued to study the principles of proportion and light, the ars geometrica of the temple. Their lodges became both workshops and sanctuaries, places where stone served as scripture. Out of these lodges, centuries later, would rise a new brotherhood, the Freemasons. The symbols they would inherit, the compass, the square, the letter G, were not inventions of the Enlightenment, but echoes of a far older discipline. The G stood not only for geometry, but for gnosis, the knowing of divine proportion, the same wisdom once guarded beneath the Temple Mount. In both Portugal and Scotland, the Solomonic legacy evolved. It shed its armor and sword, adopting new garments, the builder's apron, the navigator's map, the philosopher's chart of the heavens. Yet at its core remained the same creed, that the universe itself was a temple, and man its living measure. The Liber Lux, or Book of Light, had survived the purges and fragments. In Tamar, copies of its diagrams were hidden within the ornamentation of cloisters, patterns of interlaced circles forming 6-pointed stars, suns enclosed by petals. In Scotland, the text was preserved orally, its teachings encoded in ritual. Apprentices traced chalk lines on the floor, circles and triangles, before beginning their labors, reciting phrases that, though altered by time, still carried the rhythm of the old vow. Measure in silence, build in truth, for the light hides in proportion. As decades became centuries, the old Templar name faded into legend, yet their architectural grammar spoke louder than words. The cathedral builders of the Gothic age, the architects of Renaissance Italy, even the early stonemasons of Rosslyn Chapel in the 15th century, all bore marks of the same unseen lineage. Rosslyn, carved from the sandstone hills of Midlothian, became one of the most eloquent whispers of this secret inheritance. Built by the Sinclair family, whose ancestors had ties to both the Templars and the Norse Earls of Orkney, the chapel's walls bloomed with carvings of stars, angels, and vines spiraling in perfect geometric harmony. Hidden among them were symbols that predated Christianity: the seal of Solomon, the twin pillars, the rose and the vine entwined. The chapel's crypt, so legend holds, concealed not gold nor relics, but knowledge. Scrolls preserved from Jerusalem, brought by the sea centuries before. None can prove it, none can disprove it. Perhaps that is the nature of the Solomonic tradition: to reveal by concealment, to teach by silence. In the quiet of monastic libraries and in the smoky air of Masonic halls, the story of the Templars transformed. They were no longer seen merely as warriors or martyrs, but as custodians of an idea: that divine truth is not dictated, but discovered, not granted, but built. Their secret was never domination, but balance, the same balance that Solomon's priests once guarded between heaven and earth. Through navigation, architecture, and the geometry of faith, they preserved that code, allowing it to whisper through time, from the echoing naves of cathedrals to the compass rose of a ship's chart. And though their order had died in name, the measure of their temple lived on, in every stone aligned to the stars, in every line drawn by a craftsman's steady hand, in every soul who sought light through understanding.
By the 15th century, the silence that had once cloaked the Templar legacy began to take form once again, this time in marble, parchment, and light. The fires of the Middle Ages were dimming, and in their ashes a new flame emerged: the Renaissance. In cities like Florence, Venice, and Lisbon, the pursuit of beauty became inseparable from the pursuit of truth. Artists, mathematicians, and architects spoke in the same tongue: proportion. It was in this rediscovery of measure that the hidden current of the Solomonic order found its voice anew. The secrets once buried beneath the Temple Mount and whispered among the Templars' inner circles began to resurface in the open, cloaked not in vows of knighthood, but in the language of science and art. In Florence, Filippo Brunelleschi stood at the heart of this awakening. Trained as a goldsmith and sculptor, he would become the architect who crowned the city with a dome so vast that it seemed to contain heaven itself. Yet few understood the source of his inspiration. Beneath his study of Roman ruins lay a deeper geometry, one echoing the proportions of Solomon's temple. His notebooks, filled with sketches and ratios, contained diagrams identical to those found in the Liber Lux: intersecting circles forming hexagrams, the sacred ratio of 1 to square root of 2, and harmonic divisions that mirrored the Solomonic measure of the altar. Brunelleschi never claimed divine revelation; he spoke only of mathematics. Yet in his precision, something ancient stirred: the belief that number was the language of creation. When the dome of Santa Maria del Fiore rose above Florence, its proportions mirrored those of the heavenly sphere described in the Book of Wisdom. Those who entered its shadow felt not the weight of stone, but the rhythm of eternity. It was, in essence, the temple reborn in form, not through creed, but through understanding. Elsewhere, in Lisbon and Coimbra, members of the Order of Christ continued their quiet stewardship of the old Templar science. Their monasteries became centers of cartography and navigation. The maps produced under their supervision bore strange annotations, lines crossing the oceans in arcs that followed not merely compass bearings, but celestial harmonics. The sailors of Portugal, guided by these charts, became explorers of both the sea and the unseen. When Vasco da Gama set sail for India, his ships carried not only goods and weapons, but symbols carved into their woodwork: the cross of the Order of Christ, descendant of the Templar Red Cross. Beneath it lay a deeper creed, inherited from the Solomonic tradition, that the world, vast as it was, could be known through harmony, that even chaos followed divine geometry.
In the courts of Europe, the Solomonic flame flickered among scholars who sought unity between faith and reason. Marsilio Ficino, the philosopher of Florence, translated the Corpus Hermeticum, reintroducing the ancient principle that God geometrizes continually. In those words, he echoed the same creed once spoken beneath the Temple Mount, as above, so below. Leonardo da Vinci, whose mind bridged the divine and the mechanical, drew the Vitruvian Man, a figure suspended between circle and square, the symbol of balance between heaven and earth. Scholars later called it a study of human proportion, yet in its symmetry, the Solomonic seal returned once more, the union of opposites, the perfect measure of creation reflected in man himself. To Leonardo, geometry was not mere measurement, it was meditation. He filled pages with interlocking stars and spirals, annotations on light, shadow, and the soul. Proportion, he wrote, is not the invention of man, but the image of God. Had he known the origins of those ideas, or merely felt their pull through intuition? Perhaps it was neither, for truth once set in motion needs no master to keep its course. The influence of the old order was not confined to artists and thinkers. It moved quietly through secret circles, gatherings of philosophers, masons, and alchemists who saw in geometry the bridge between spirit and matter. In Florence, these men met under the guise of study. In London, they gathered in guild halls. In Prague, beneath the court of Rudolf II, they built laboratories dedicated to the philosopher's art. Their symbols, the rose, the compass, the square, and the six-pointed star, spoke to one another across borders and centuries. Each stood as a silent echo of Solomon's seal, the sign of unity between the visible and the invisible. These brotherhoods called themselves by many names: the Arte di Muratori, the Collegia Fabrorum, and later the Fraternitas Rosae Crucis, the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross. In them, fragments of the Templar and Solomonic teachings converged once more. They taught that truth was not given, but discovered, and that every craftsman, philosopher, and seeker was, in his labor, rebuilding the inner temple. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe had changed. The cathedrals still rose like frozen prayers, but the minds of men were turning toward the stars. The Solomonic vision of balance, proportion, and divine harmony found a new expression in astronomy and physics. Nicholas Copernicus, studying the motion of planets, wrote in tones of reverence that the cosmos itself was a temple of perfect order. Johannes Kepler, centuries after the Templars had vanished, described God as a geometer and the universe as being written in the language of number. What the priests of Solomon had guarded in secrecy, what the Templars had veiled beneath their vows, now unfolded in plain sight, not as heresy, but as science. The circle had closed. And yet, beneath this age of reason, the quiet current remained. Within the lodges of Freemasons rising across Europe, initiates still whispered the old creed as they traced compasses on polished wood. To build is to remember. To measure is to pray. The temple is not lost. It waits within the measure of the soul. In the geometry of domes, the music of spheres, and the voyages that mapped the unseen, the Solomonic order lived on, not in banners or swords, but in the rhythm of thought itself. What began as a brotherhood beneath the Temple of Jerusalem had become the pulse of an age that sought the divine through reason and the infinite through form. And though their name was forgotten, their presence lingered, as light does, long after its source has been extinguished.
By the 17th century, the old world of kings and cathedrals had begun to tremble. The Renaissance had lit the lamps of inquiry, and now the air of Europe was thick with questions. What was once veiled in the sanctuaries of the temple and whispered in alchemical manuscripts now drifted through the salons and academies. Yet, amid the hum of discovery, there persisted an undercurrent, a thread of ancient memory binding scholars, masons, and mystics alike. The Solomonic flame, long hidden beneath the robes of the Templars and the geometry of cathedrals, was being kindled anew. Its keepers now moved beneath different names: Rosicrucians, Invisible College, and later,
Freemasons. Each of these circles drew from the same unseen well, that secret union between divine wisdom and human reason that had once breathed life into the stones of Jerusalem. It began, as all great revivals do, with a whisper. In 1614, a small book appeared in Kassel, Germany. It was titled Fama Fraternitatis, and it told of a mysterious brotherhood, the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross, founded by an initiate known as Christian Rosencreuz. The text spoke of secret wisdom drawn from the East, of a temple hidden from the eyes of the unworthy, and of the promise of enlightenment for all mankind. To some, it was mere allegory. To others, it was revelation. The Fama and its companion works, Confessio Fraternitatis and the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencreuz, spread through Europe like wildfire. Scholars, alchemists, and theologians wrote feverishly, trying to decode the meaning of the rose and the cross. Hidden within their symbolism lay the same ancient triad that Solomon's order had guarded, the union of wisdom, love, and power, the geometric trinity that governed both the heavens and the soul. The Rosicrucian temple described in the Fama was said to be built upon 7 sides, crowned by a dome inscribed with the words Jesus mihi omnia, Jesus is my all. Yet beneath its Christian surface ran a current far older, one that spoke the language of numbers, light, and celestial harmony. As the Rosicrucian writing spread, a quiet transformation began within the craft guilds of stonemasons across Europe. No longer limited to builders of cathedrals, these lodges began to admit philosophers, scholars, and men of learning. Their tools, compass, square, and level, became symbols of moral and intellectual balance. These gatherings, held in candlelit chambers, began to formalize into what would later be called Freemasonry. To the uninitiated, it was a social fraternity. To the discerning, it was a continuation of the Solomonic covenant, an attempt to rebuild the spiritual temple through human understanding. Within the degrees and rituals of these lodges were echoes of the old teachings, the lost word of the builder, the search for light, the symbolic resurrection of the master, all reflections of Solomon's eternal wisdom and the Templars' vow of secrecy. The Temple of Solomon was invoked not as a place of stone, but as a symbol of the perfected human soul. In every man, one Masonic lecture declared, there lies a temple unfinished. To complete it is the labor of a lifetime. While these secret societies grew in the shadows, the Enlightenment dawned in the open. Thinkers like Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton redefined the universe as a grand mechanism. Yet their private writings hinted at more. Newton's notebooks contained pages of alchemical speculation, transcriptions of Hebrew texts, and diagrams of the Temple of Solomon drawn with almost sacred devotion. He wrote of a divine architecture that governed both the heavens and the human spirit. His pursuit of universal law, though expressed in mathematical terms, was an echo of the same Solomonic principle, that truth was order, and order was divine. Leibniz, too, saw geometry as the bridge between God and nature, writing that music is the pleasure the human soul experiences from counting without being aware that it is counting. Even in reason there was rhythm, in logic a kind of hidden music. Thus, while Europe proclaimed the age of light, the unseen temple endured, rebuilt not with mortar, but with ideas. The Masonic lodges of Britain, Scotland, and France became the quiet meeting grounds for these seekers. Within their walls, noblemen, scientists, and poets gathered under one creed, that all men were builders in the grand design of the universe. They traced Solomon's seal on parchment, recited oaths by candlelight, and studied the proportions of sacred geometry as a mirror of the divine mind. Their symbols, the all-seeing eye, the twin pillars, and the unfinished pyramid, were not inventions of the age, but inheritances from the old order. The twin pillars represented Jachin and Boaz, the entrance to Solomon's temple. The eye was the watchful presence of the divine architect. The pyramid, the eternal ascent toward light. Though the church still frowned upon such assemblies, they spread swiftly, weaving a quiet network across continents. Lodges appeared in Edinburgh, London, Paris, and Lisbon. In them, men of differing faiths met as equals, bound by the ancient call to perfect the temple within. As the century advanced, the ideals of these hidden circles began to spill into the open world. Across Europe and the New World, revolutions stirred. The same principles of balance, equality, and illumination that had once guided builders and mystics now inspired philosophers and statesmen. The Solomonic dream of harmony between heaven's order and human justice became the philosophical foundation of liberty itself. Many of the architects of the modern age, from Francis Bacon to Benjamin Franklin, were steeped in these mysteries. They believed that through reason, virtue, and the pursuit of light, humanity could rebuild the lost temple of wisdom upon the foundations of a freer world. The Rosicrucian manifestos had promised the dawn of a new age of enlightenment. Now that dawn began to break. But with light comes shadow. And in the centuries that followed, the Solomonic current would flow into paths both noble and obscure, giving rise to new empires of thought, secret orders, and the enduring myth that somewhere, beneath the visible world, the true temple still awaited completion. As the candles burned low in the Masonic halls, the old words were still spoken, softly, almost as a prayer. The temple is not lost. Its plan endures in the heart of man. The light that shone in Solomon's court burns still within those who seek in silence.
By the 18th century, the light of reason had spread across Europe and beyond. The kingdoms of the Old World trembled before new ideas. Liberty, equality, fraternity, words that carried echoes of geometry, balance, and divine proportion. And beneath the public revolutions of this age, there moved a quieter one, an invisible architecture of thought, guided by those who still traced their lineage to the Order of Solomon. Their symbols no longer adorned armor or stone fortresses. They were carved instead into constitutions, public buildings, and the new languages of freedom. The Solomonic Code, once whispered in the shadows of the Temple Mount, now shaped the moral and philosophical foundations of the modern world. In the cities of Europe and the colonies of the New World, the lodges of Freemasonry flourished. Their candlelit chambers became meeting places for scholars, craftsmen, philosophers, and revolutionaries. In London, Edinburgh, and Paris, the rituals of initiation preserved the same triad of ancient meaning: wisdom, strength, and beauty, the spiritual pillars of Solomon's temple. Each degree represented a stage of inner building, the apprentice learning the measure of creation, the fellow-craft discovering the harmony of proportion, and the master mason confronting the mystery of mortality and rebirth. These rites, veiled in allegory, were echoes of an older doctrine, that man himself was the unfinished temple, and that every act of understanding brought one stone closer to completion. From these chambers, ideas radiated outward, ideas that would reshape nations. In the American colonies, whispers of Masonic thought merged with the fervor of independence. The Founding Fathers, many of them initiated into lodges in Boston, Philadelphia, and Paris, saw in the new republic the possibility of building a temple, not of stone, but of principle. The design of Washington, D.C., conceived by Pierre Charles L'Enfant,
a Freemason, was laid out in patterns of sacred geometry, streets converging in pentagonal and triangular alignments that echoed the proportions of Solomon's temple and the cosmic harmony of Pythagoras. The Great Seal of the United States, bearing the unfinished pyramid and the all-seeing eye, proclaimed in Latin, Annui coeptis, he has favored our undertakings, and Novus Ordo Siculorum, a new order of the ages. Few understood that beneath the rhetoric of liberty lay a spiritual ideal older than any nation, the Solomonic vision of divine architecture expressed through human order. In Europe, similar forces stirred. In France, Enlightenment lodges became crucibles of social reform. Within their chambers, philosophers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu debated the moral architecture of society, reason, justice, fraternity, each principle a reflection of the ancient triad that once adorned the temple's inner sanctum. When the French Revolution erupted, its symbols bore unmistakable traces of this heritage: the eye of Providence on revolutionary banners, the compass and square etched into medallions, the cry for equality framed as the balance of measure, an echo perhaps unknowingly of the Solomonic creed. Yet, as with all light, its brilliance cast shadows. What had begun as the pursuit of harmony turned in places to chaos. The dream of a perfect order was tested by human imperfection, as it always had been. The Solomonic flame endured, but flickered between revelation and misuse, wisdom and ambition. As the 18th century drew to its close, Europe entered an age of empires. Science advanced. Machines began to hum where cathedrals once echoed. But even in this age of industry, the secret threads of the old wisdom continued to weave themselves through the fabric of progress. In the Royal Society of London, the birthplace of modern science, many founding members had been Freemasons or Rosicrucians. They believed that to study nature was to read the handwriting of God, and that every law discovered was a glimpse of the divine geometry underlying all creation. In their experiments with light, motion, and magnetism, they sought the same unity Solomon's priests once contemplated beneath the golden temple lamps, the balance between visible and invisible forces. And beyond the laboratories, in the ateliers of artists and architects, the sacred ratios continued to guide the hand. From the neoclassical facades of Europe's great cities to the hidden geometries in Beethoven's compositions, the old measure, the Solomonic proportion, endured. Even as the Enlightenment dethroned the mythic, it preserved its structure, translating mystery into mathematics and faith into philosophy. It was as if the old order had shed its robes of secrecy only to clothe itself with reason. Across the Atlantic, in the newly formed United States, this transformation took physical form. The cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol was laid in 1793 by George Washington wearing Masonic regalia. The ceremony, carefully timed to the movements of the sun, mirrored the ancient rite of temple dedication. Corn, wine, and oil were poured as offerings, symbols of nourishment, joy, and peace. The same ritual used by Solomon's priests in the consecration of the first temple. To those who witnessed it, it was a civic event. To those who understood, it was a continuation, a thread unbroken since Jerusalem's sacred hill. The Republic was the new temple, its people the builders, its foundation laid upon the same principles of balance and light that had guided generations before. And while the language had changed, no longer invoking God as architect, but nature as law, the meaning remained. The Solomonic vision had become the architecture of democracy. By the turn of the 19th century, the world was entering a new dawn. The printing press, the telescope, the compass, and the machine had made knowledge universal. The old mysteries scattered like fragments of a mosaic, hidden no longer in cathedrals or crypts, but in books, libraries, and academies. Yet, among the initiates who still met in quiet lodges, the ancient creed endured, not as superstition, but as remembrance. They taught that knowledge without wisdom leads only to imbalance, and that the true Temple of Solomon was not built in any one place, but wherever men sought harmony with the divine. They spoke still of the seal, the union of opposites, the reconciliation of heaven and earth, and they believed that as long as men measured, built, and sought the light, the Order of Solomon would never truly vanish. In a letter preserved in the archives of a Lisbon lodge dated 1807, a master wrote to his brethren, "Brothers, though kingdoms fall and empires fade, the plan endures, the compass is still steady, the temple rises not in stone, but in the heart that knows its measure. So long as light and shadow meet, Solomon's covenant lives within us."
The 19th century dawned in smoke and iron. Factories rose where monasteries once stood, and the pulse of progress echoed in the rhythm of machines. Yet even as the age of reason reached its zenith, an undercurrent stirred beneath its surface, the yearning for mystery. For in the heart of every age of light, there lingers the shadow of forgotten fire. The ancient Solomonic current, long translated into geometry, science, and philosophy, began to flow again in strange new forms. It emerged in the drawing rooms of mystics, in the libraries of scholars, and in secret gatherings where the veil between science and the sacred grew thin. The world believed it had outgrown mystery, but mystery had not outgrown the world. In Paris, London, and Vienna, new brotherhoods arose, societies devoted to the study of the unseen. They called themselves Theosophists, Hermeticists, Rosicrucians, and Magicians of the Golden Dawn. Each traced its lineage not to superstition, but to a deeper heritage, the wisdom of the ancients, the lost sciences of Solomon's temple, the geometry of heaven mirrored in man. These seekers were not rebels against reason. They were its heirs, seeking to extend its reach beyond the visible. They believed that where physics ended, metaphysics began, and that the temple of truth stood on both foundations. Their libraries filled with rediscovered manuscripts, the Sefer Yetzirah, the Zohar, the Hermetic Corpus, and translations of Arabic and Coptic scrolls that had survived in desert monasteries. Within their pages, these new mystics found familiar echoes of number and name, light and sound, proportion and spirit, the same principles that had guided the priests of Solomon and the builders of the Templar halls. In 1875, a Russian noblewoman named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky founded the Theosophical Society in New York. Her writings, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, spoke of ancient wisdom preserved through the ages by hidden brotherhoods. She wrote of a universal architecture of consciousness, a cosmic geometry that bound all life together. Though her language was new, her vision was ancient, the Solomonic belief in a bridge between heaven and earth, between divine intelligence and human understanding. Blavatsky's teachings revived interest in the Kabbalah, in sacred proportion, and in the idea that symbols were not inventions, but revelations, windows into a higher order. Her followers called it the ageless wisdom. Others whispered that it was the old temple language reborn. At the same time in London, another current took shape, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Founded in 1887, it brought together scholars, poets, and philosophers who sought to decode the hidden architecture of the universe through ritual,
symbol, and study. Their initiations were patterned upon the passage through the temple, from the outer court of ignorance, through the pillars of balance, into the sanctum of inner light. The tools of Solomon's masons, compass, square, and plumb, adorned their altars, reimagined as instruments of the soul. Among their members were writers whose words still echo in modern literature: W.B. Yeats, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, each drawn to the idea that truth was not merely known, but experienced, built stone by invisible stone within the self. They spoke of inner architecture, of the temple as consciousness itself, the same vision Solomon's priests had guarded in silence beneath Jerusalem's stones. Elsewhere, the pursuit of light found new language in science. Electricity, magnetism, and radiation revealed forces unseen, yet undeniably real. For some, these discoveries confirmed what mystics had always claimed, that the universe was woven with invisible threads, that energy was the true fabric of creation. Scientists like Faraday and Maxwell described the cosmos in terms of fields and vibrations. Mystics described it as spirit and resonance. The words differed, but the melody was the same. Both sought harmony, the Solomonic balance between knowledge and wonder. In architecture, too, the old proportions returned. From the neo-Gothic revival to the Beaux Arts grandeur of Paris, designers rediscovered the sacred ratios of antiquity. The facades of universities, museums, and government halls echoed the geometry of cathedrals. For even amid modernity, man still built in the language of eternity. The Solomonic lineage did not survive only in symbols. It endured in spirit. In quiet corners of Europe, Masonic lodges continued their traditions, preserving rites that had barely changed in centuries. Candles were still lit before compasses and pillars. Initiates still swore to seek the light of wisdom and to labor upon the invisible temple. They spoke no longer of crusades or holy wars, but of moral architecture, the building of character, reason, and truth. The tools of the builder had become tools of the mind. And yet beneath the measured rhythm of these rituals, the ancient longing remained, to recover what had been lost beneath the Temple Mount. Not gold nor relics, but knowledge, the blueprint of divine order. As the century waned, the Solomonic current crossed oceans once more. In America, the new frontier of invention and expansion, lodges flourished beside factories and universities. Engineers and architects embraced Masonic geometry. Poets and philosophers rediscovered Hermetic symbolism. From the design of Washington's monuments to the secret emblems on dollar bills, the old order symbols lingered in plain sight, seen by all, understood by few. The all-seeing eye, radiant above the pyramid, became not only the emblem of vigilance, but the reminder of unity, the eternal watcher between heaven and earth. The unfinished pyramid was not merely a sign of national ambition, but a spiritual metaphor, the work of creation incomplete, ever ascending toward light. The Solomonic creed had passed beyond religion, beyond secrecy. It had become the quiet architecture of civilization itself. By the final years of the 1800s, the world stood between two temples, one of progress, one of spirit. The telegraph carried voices through air. The steamship crossed oceans in days. Electric lamps turned night into day. Yet, in the midst of such wonders, seekers still gathered to meditate on the simplest of truths, that all form is number, that all number is harmony, and that harmony is divine. In an 1892 lodge record from Edinburgh, a closing benediction was inscribed. The light of Solomon is no single flame. It burns in all who measure truth in silence. The temple stands, not in stone, but in the understanding of those who build within. The 19th century ended as it began, with the hum of machines and the murmur of mystery. The sons of Solomon had long since vanished from the annals of history, yet their covenant endured, carried in architecture, in art, in the measured pulse of human reason. And as the world stepped into the modern age, it did so beneath unseen arches, built upon foundations far older than time.
The 20th century opened with the rumble of engines and the flicker of electric light. Humanity stood poised between two forces, the rational brilliance of its inventions and the silent echo of its forgotten wisdom. The industrial age had reshaped the earth, but in its restless expansion, many felt an emptiness that progress alone could not fill. Beneath the machinery and the maps, the old current stirred again. The Solomonic thread, faint but unbroken, weaving through the centuries' chaos and creation alike. In the first years of the new century, cities rose like new temples of glass and steel. Architects sought to capture light itself, to harness the heavens within their designs. The symmetry of their blueprints owed more to forgotten geometry than they knew. The same ratios that once measured Solomon's temple, the golden mean, the sacred seven, the perfect square, now defined skyscrapers and civic halls. Yet beneath this outward triumph of order, another architecture was forming, the invisible structures of societies, lodges, and circles of thought. Masonry, long associated with the moral and symbolic craft of building, entered its modern form. Its lodges spread across continents, their members now statesmen, inventors, and artists. Within their walls, amid the scent of old wood and candle flame, the rituals remained unchanged. The laying of the cornerstone, the invocation of light, the vow to labor toward wisdom. For all its public respectability, Masonry still carried within it the silent doctrine of the Solomonic covenant that progress without proportion and power without knowledge lead to ruin. When war descended upon Europe in 1914, that warning seemed prophetic. The great powers, forged in reason and science, turned their mastery of mechanics toward destruction. The trenches of Flanders and the deserts of the Middle East became places where ancient prophecies met modern horror. And yet, even there, the echo of Solomon's temple lingered. British and French archaeologists, following armies through Palestine, uncovered the ruins of Jerusalem's past. Shards of pottery, fragments of inscriptions, and beneath the Temple Mount, new chambers, unseen for centuries. These discoveries stirred the imagination of soldiers and scholars alike. To many, it seemed as if the war had reopened not only the earth, but memory itself. Among those who marched beneath foreign suns were men who carried the symbols of the old Brotherhood. Squares, compasses, stars, engraved on lockets or stitched discreetly into uniform linings. To them, these were not emblems of secrecy, but of endurance, a reminder that every generation is a builder, even amid ruins. After the Great War, the world sought meaning amid loss. The Roaring Twenties brought speed, music, and the illusion of progress restored. But in quiet rooms, the search for wisdom deepened. Occult and philosophical societies flourished once more. The Theosophical Society expanded its influence, and in England, the Golden Dawn splintered into smaller orders, each preserving fragments of the same esoteric lineage. Across the Atlantic, lodges and study circles multiplied. Writers like Manly P. Hall and Paul Foster Case began to translate the old symbols into modern language, teaching that the Temple of Solomon was a metaphor for consciousness, a structure to be refined through understanding and compassion. Hall's monumental work, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, 1928, became a bridge between eras.
Its pages depicted the seal of Solomon beside the emblems of Egypt, Greece, and the Templars, asserting that all sacred traditions spoke in the same geometric tongue. His words echoed the ancient creed. When the builder measures rightly, he imitates the order of heaven. Through such voices, the Solomonic flame survived the storm of modernity, not as dogma, but as a quiet philosophy of proportion amid chaos. Then came the Second War, darker, vaster, more consuming than the first. As cities fell and empires crumbled, the world's hidden networks stirred once more. In the shadows of Nazi Germany, esoteric orders twisted the old symbols into instruments of power. The swastika, once a solar emblem of cosmic harmony, was turned into a mark of tyranny. Ancient myths were stripped of meaning and recast as weapons of ideology. The sacred geometry of Solomon's seal, the union of opposites, became a symbol misused, its message inverted. Yet while the light was corrupted in one corner of the world, it was protected in another. Scholars, refugees, and mystics fled across continents, carrying manuscripts, maps, and memories of the old knowledge. In neutral cities like Lisbon, Cairo, and Istanbul, quiet circles met in exile. They spoke of rebuilding not nations, but the inner order, of preserving the lineage of understanding that had once united priests, masons, and seekers across time. After the 1945, when silence finally returned to Europe, the rebuilding began, both physical and spiritual. The modern world, weary of destruction, rediscovered the ancient idea that architecture could heal. In the ruins of Warsaw and Dresden, new planners drew upon sacred proportion to restore harmony to cities torn apart. In America, Frank Wright White spoke of organic architecture, buildings that echoed Nietzsche's geometry. His designs, though modern, followed the same principles found in the temple's blueprints: unity, light, and living proportion. Even in science, the Solomonic impulse reappeared. The new physics revealed a universe structured by symmetry, resonance, and pattern. The equations of Einstein, the spirals of galaxies, the lattice of atoms, all reflected a hidden order not unlike the divine geometry once inscribed in Solomon's ring. What had once been mysticism was now mathematics. And so the Old Covenant found a new expression in relativity, in quantum fields, in the quiet acknowledgement that beneath chaos lies harmony, an ancient truth rediscovered by modern minds. By the mid-century, new societies arose, not bound by secrecy, but by study. The Rosicrucian Order AMORC established libraries and museums dedicated to the preservation of esoteric knowledge, while philosophical circles revived the teachings of Pythagoras, Kabbalah, and Hermetic science. In the deserts of California and the gardens of France, temples were built again, not of gold or marble, but of glass and light, dedicated to meditation and reflection. Their architects designed them in accordance with sacred geometry, believing that every proportion could tune the human spirit to harmony. At the same time, the age of exploration turned inward. The astronauts of the 1960s, heirs of both science and myth, carried symbols of light beyond the atmosphere. When they gazed back upon the earth floating in the void, they saw not empire or creed, but a single circle, a living seal of unity, radiant against darkness. It was the ancient vision of Solomon renewed, the cosmos as temple, creation as sacred order. The latter half of the 20th century saw technology rise as the new craft. Circuits replaced compasses, and networks replaced lodges. Yet even in the digital lattice, patterns of sacred proportion emerged. Designers and engineers spoke of elegant code, golden ratios, symmetry, and systems. The language had changed, but the instinct remained the same: to build with beauty, to mirror the unseen harmony of the world. In quiet corners, Freemasons still gathered. Initiates still traced the square and compass on velvet cloth. Their ceremonies, unchanged through centuries, continued to echo Solomon's first prayer at the dedication of the temple. That thine eyes may be open toward this house night and day. The house, they said, was not a place, but the world itself, the ever unfinished temple of understanding. By the end of the 20th century, humanity had circled back to where it began, searching for balance between the material and the divine, the measurable and the mysterious. In art, music, and science alike, the Solomonic vision breathed quietly. Fractals, holograms, and the geometry of DNA revealed that creation itself was a temple of pattern. The cosmos, once mapped by mystics with compass and prayer, now unfolded through telescopes and equations, yet the message remained unchanged. All is number, and number is harmony. In 1999, as the millennium turned, a Masonic historian wrote, "The age of light has not replaced the temple. It has revealed its walls to be the stars themselves. The covenant endures, not in stone, not in scripture, but in every mind that seeks proportion in the face of chaos, and in every hand that builds with understanding." The torch.
The dawn of the 21st century rose in silence, a digital hum beneath the stars. Humanity stood upon the threshold of a new age, where knowledge flowed without walls, and ancient mysteries, once guarded by oaths and rituals, could be summoned by a single gesture across a screen. Yet, beneath the surface of this modern awakening, the same timeless question lingered. Has the wisdom of Solomon been preserved, or merely forgotten beneath new forms of light? At the turn of the millennium, the architecture of the world began to change once again. No longer bound by stone or mortar, human creation shifted toward invisible structures, data centers, algorithms, networks stretching across oceans. These were the temples of the new era, vast, silent sanctuaries of information. Their builders, like the masons of old, pursued proportion and balance, though now measured in code and computation. In the glowing heart of servers, in the circuitry of microchips, the same principles of sacred geometry appeared once more. Mathematicians and engineers spoke of elegant solutions, harmonic design, and recursive beauty. The ancient axiom, "as above, so below," had taken on a modern form. Where Solomon's architects once drew circles upon parchment, today's builders mapped invisible spheres of influence, tracing the lattice of connections that mirrored the structure of galaxies. Beneath the hum of machines, the Solomonic impulse endured, the desire to reflect divine order through human design. In the early years of the century, a quiet resurgence of interest in sacred knowledge took root. Historians revisited the ruins of Jerusalem with new technologies, ground-penetrating radar, 3D imaging, and spectral analysis, revealing tunnels and chambers that had lain sealed for millennia. These findings reignited old debates. What lay beneath the Temple Mount? What had the early Templars truly sought there? Most discoveries were modest, shards, foundations, traces of altars, yet each layer spoke to a continuity of reverence that defied time. Even as science sought empirical truth, it often found itself standing before mysteries that demanded silence, not certainty. The Order of Solomon, once whispered in legend, returned to scholarly discussion, not as myth, but as metaphor, a symbol of humanity's ancient commitment to balance wisdom and power. To many, this was the essence of the Solomonic covenant, that knowledge must serve harmony, not dominion. The world, however, was changing faster than any era before.
Digital light replaced candlelight. Knowledge multiplied beyond comprehension. The human mind, once the keeper of memory, became an interpreter of endless streams of information. Philosophers warned that wisdom was being replaced by data, that the sacred had become the searchable. And yet, within the noise, there were those who listened for the old music. Architects, artists, and thinkers turned once more to sacred proportion. The works of Leonardo, Vitruvius, and the builders of the temple were studied anew, now through the lens of complexity theory and quantum design. The idea that the universe itself was constructed through geometric harmony, once a mystical belief, found echoes in modern science. The resonance of atomic bonds, the fractal patterns of nature, the symmetry of DNA, all mirrored the same laws that guided the ancient Masons. As one physicist observed, "We have not discovered new laws of creation, we have merely learned to see the old ones more clearly." In cathedrals and mosques, restored for the new millennium, light once again became a teacher. Sunlight through stained glass, moonlight across marble floors, these eternal dialogues of radiance and matter reminded all who entered that the divine still spoke through design. The architects of the modern age, inspired by this, began to build cities that breathed, structures that moved with wind, responded to light, and echoed the rhythm of the earth itself. The Solomonic idea of the living temple, the union of the built and the natural, returned in the language of sustainability and organic design. To some, this was not merely environmental thought, but a reawakening of sacred stewardship. The world itself was the temple, and humanity, once again, its custodian. In quiet societies across the globe, new lodges and philosophical circles emerged, not shrouded in secrecy, but dedicated to study and meditation. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, Hermeticists, and Kabbalistic scholars began to collaborate openly, sharing archives once sealed for centuries. Digitized manuscripts of ancient wisdom spread across the internet, the Emerald Tablet, the Clavicula Solomonis, and the writings of the early Templar scholars. These works, once hidden behind oaths, now belonged to all who sought them. But this openness came with its own test. Without the discipline of initiation, knowledge risked losing its meaning. The true keepers of Solomon's order understood that revelation was not illumination, that light, without the patience of understanding, could still blind. Thus, even in an age of transparency, the principle of silence endured. Wisdom begins when speech ends. Meanwhile, in the realm of science, a strange convergence unfolded. Quantum physicists spoke of a universe woven together by unseen connections, entanglement, resonance, and the mysterious geometry of space-time. Their equations described what mystics had once intuited, that creation is unified, that matter and spirit are not opposites, but reflections. The language of Solomon's ring, the merging of opposites within the seal, now echoed in the very mathematics of reality. Physicists called it symmetry, the ancients called it balance. And in that shared pursuit, the chasm between the sacred and the scientific began to close. Across the world, in art and design, the Solomonic signature returned once more. Temples of modernity, museums, observatories, memorials, were designed not as monuments to ego, but as sanctuaries of proportion and stillness. In Spain, light flowed through the curves of Gaudi's Sagrada Familia, still unfinished, yet timeless. In Abu Dhabi, the Louvre's dome filtered sunlight in a pattern that resembled the celestial diagrams of old. In Jerusalem itself, The renewed study of ancient sacred geometry informed the restoration of the old city's walls, a gesture of unity between past and present. Everywhere humanity seemed to remember, however faintly, that beauty and balance were not luxuries but necessities, that harmony was not a dream but the design of existence itself. In 2020, as the world fell silent beneath a global stillness, many found themselves returning to reflection. Temples, churches, and lodges closed their doors, yet in homes across the planet, candles were lit, prayers whispered, meditations begun. The solitude reminded humanity of its shared fragility, and perhaps its forgotten covenant. For a time, the old rhythm returned: silence, patience, gratitude. And within that pause, many rediscovered the essence of the Solomonic teaching, that the temple was never a building, but a state of awareness, built through humility and understanding. By the mid-2020s, a new generation of seekers had emerged: architects, digital creators, and philosophers who no longer saw the division between science and spirituality. They spoke of fractal consciousness, geometric unity, and the architecture of thought. Through virtual reality, they reconstructed ancient temples not merely to preserve them, but to experience them, to walk once more through the light of Jerusalem, the corridors of Chartres, the stones of Rosslyn Chapel. These digital sanctuaries, born of code, became extensions of the same ancient work, an eternal attempt to rebuild the temple within and without. And so the circle turns once more. From Solomon's golden ring to the glowing ring of a digital horizon, the covenant endures. The same call to balance power with understanding, faith with knowledge, heaven with earth. The form has changed, but the purpose remains: to seek harmony within creation and to honor the unseen geometry that binds all things. The Solomonic order may no longer exist in name, but its essence flows through every hand.
Night falls upon the modern world as softly as it once did over ancient Jerusalem. The rhythm of life, pulsing through cities and circuits alike, slows for a moment, and beneath the hum of progress, a deeper silence is felt. It is the same silence that once filled the courts of Solomon's temple, when the priests paused between hymns to listen for the breath of God within the stones. The story of the Order of Solomon, whispered through millennia, does not end in a ruin or a relic. It continues, unseen, within the architecture of the human spirit. In every age there have been builders, men and women, who sensed that creation was not chaos but composition, that the universe itself sang in proportion. They built temples, cathedrals, observatories, and later, algorithms and galaxies of light. Each structure, physical or mental, was an attempt to express the same truth, that harmony is the signature of the divine. The Templars, the Masons, the scholars of sacred geometry, they were not guardians of treasure, but interpreters of pattern. And that pattern endures, written into the very code of existence. The double triangle of Solomon's seal, one pointing upward, one downward, remains the simplest expression of the greatest mystery, that the infinite reflects itself through the finite, that heaven descends to earth as earth aspires to heaven. It is balance, not power, that sustains the world. In the quiet halls of research centers and universities, modern scientists now explore the universe with tools far beyond the imagination of any ancient sage. They measure cosmic background radiation, map the curvature of space-time,
and trace the delicate symmetry of subatomic particles. Yet their discoveries often lead them to the same awe once known by temple builders, a recognition that the cosmos is not random, but resonant. The physicist's symmetry, the musician's harmony, the architect's proportion, all are reflections of the same underlying order. It is the Solomonic truth reborn through reason that all things, when measured rightly, sing together in a quiet music of being. A century that once seemed to have severed spirit from science now finds the two intertwined again, not by creed, but by curiosity.